I never expected to find the email. It was buried in my father's drafts folder when I was helping him set up his new laptop, the one he insisted only I could configure properly despite calling me technically incompetent for years. Regarding my son, Oliver, was the subject line. My finger hesitated over the mouse pad, but something pulled me to open it. Lambert, I know you're considering Oliver for the partnership position, my father had written to his closest business associate, but I strongly advise against it. Despite carrying my name, he lacks the fundamental intelligence and drive necessary for our industry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The boy has been a disappointment since birth, always reaching for opportunities beyond his capabilities. Trust me when I say he'll never amount to anything significant. I've accepted this reality. I suggest you do the same. We can discuss more suitable candidates when we meet. The words burned into my retinas as I stared at the screen. My hands began to shake, the laptop suddenly feeling hot against my thighs. The timestamp showed it was drafted just yesterday, mere hours after he'd smiled at me across the dinner table, raising a toast to my son, who keeps surprising me. The same day I'd told him about my interview with Lambert Partners, the prestigious engineering firm that could change my career trajectory. I read it again, my throat tightening with each word. A disappointment since birth. Lacks the fundamental intelligence. Never amount to anything significant. This wasn't a momentary outburst or a frustrated comment made in anger. This was a calculated character assassination, carefully composed, and nearly sent to the one person who could determine my professional future. The living room around me seemed to distort, the gleaming surfaces of my father's meticulously designed home suddenly feeling alien. For 28 years, I'd believed that beneath his criticism and impossible standards lay genuine love and respect. I'd convinced myself that his harshness was simply his way of pushing me to excel. Now, staring at those unvarnished words, the illusion crumbled. What my father didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn, was that for the past 4 years, I had been the silent architect behind his company's revitalization. The revolutionary resource allocation system that had cut production costs by 32% while increasing output? Mine. The predictive market analysis algorithm that had positioned Denton Industries ahead of every market shift? Also mine. The international expansion strategy that had doubled their global footprint in 18 months. My creation entirely. But my father, Alexander Denton, CEO of Denton Industries and Innovator of the Decade, according to Business Insight magazine, had no idea. Because I'd hidden behind a pseudonym, working as an external consultant through a shell company I'd established. Not to deceive him, but because 4 years ago, when I'd first approached him with these same ideas, he'd laughed me out of his office. "Stick to what you're good at, Oliver," he'd said, not even bothering to read past the first page of my proposal. Leave the real business to those who understand it. So I did what any rational, underestimated person would do. I created Horizon Solutions, secured a meeting with my father's operations director under my pseudonym Nathan Reed, and sold them the exact same ideas, which they implemented to spectacular success. For 4 years, Nathan Reed had been hailed as a visionary in quarterly reports, praised in company-wide emails, and paid consultancy fees totaling millions. Meanwhile, Oliver Denton, the real me, continued to receive belittling comments and diminishing expectations from a father who couldn't see that his company's savior was sitting across from him at family dinners. I closed the laptop slowly, my mind racing. The Lambert Partners interview was scheduled for tomorrow morning, an opportunity I had earned through years of dedicated work, advanced degrees, and proven results at smaller firms. And here was my father, actively sabotaging me behind my back, while pretending to support me to my face. I stood up, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. My father's penthouse offered a panoramic view of downtown, including the gleaming Denton Industries headquarters 6 blocks away. The building stood as a monument to Alexander Denton's success, a success that, for the past 4 years, had been invisibly fueled by my innovations. My phone buzzed with a text from him. "Finished with the laptop yet? I need it for a meeting tomorrow." No pleasantries? No thank you. Just expectation and demand, the language of our relationship. I typed back, "Almost done, need to run a few final updates." Then I returned to the drafts folder and did something I'd never done before. I deleted the email to Lambert. Not to protect myself, but because I'd decided in that moment that my father's assessment would not determine my future. "I'm still running updates," I replied, my tone neutral. "System maintenance takes time if you want it done properly." "This is exactly the problem with you," he sighed. "Simple tasks become complicated projects. I could have had the IT department at the office handle this in minutes. Then why didn't you?" The question slipped out before I could apply my usual filter. A brief silence. "Excuse me? If the IT department could do it better and faster, why ask me?" Another pause. "I was trying to give you something to do, Oliver. Lord knows you need the experience if you're seriously pursuing this Lambert position." The casual cruelty, the dismissal masked as opportunity. It was all so familiar that I almost defaulted to my normal response. Apologize, promise to do better, thank him for the chance to prove myself. But the image of that email draft remained vivid in my mind. "I'll bring the laptop to your office tomorrow," I said instead. "I have an early meeting near your building anyway." "The Lambert interview?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "Yes." "Well, don't get your hopes too high. Lambert only interviews Denton men as a courtesy to me. They understand your limitations." My hand tightened around the phone. "I appreciate your honesty, Dad. Just being realistic, son. Someone has to be." After hanging up, I returned to my documentation with renewed purpose. By 3 a.m., I had compiled a comprehensive record of Nathan Reed's contributions to Denton Industries, organizing it into a clear narrative that even a financial layperson could understand. The story was undeniable. Nathan Reed had saved Alexander, Denton's company, and transformed it into the powerhouse it was today. I also discovered something I hadn't known. My father had recently negotiated to acquire Horizon Solutions, my company, for $40 million, believing it would give him exclusive access to Nathan Reed's brilliance, while eliminating the substantial consultancy fees. The acquisition was scheduled to close in 1 week, with only the final paperwork and signatures remaining. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling as dawn began to break. Alexander Denton was about to pay $40 million to acquire a company that existed solely as a vehicle for his son's rejected ideas. Ideas he could have had for free if he'd ever bothered to listen. For the first time in years, I laughed. A genuine, cathartic release that echoed through my apartment. The situation was beyond ironic. It was cosmically absurd. By 6 a.m., I had made a decision. I showered, dressed in my sharpest suit, and gathered 3 things. My father's laptop, now fully updated, a USB drive containing all the Nathan Reed documentation, and the quiet, unshakable resolve of someone who has finally seen the truth. Father had spent a lifetime telling me who I was. Limited, disappointing, incapable. Today, he would learn who I really am. And in 1 week, he would discover exactly what I'm worth. As I left my apartment, the sun was rising over the city, casting long shadows from the skyscrapers. Among them, Denton Industries headquarters stood, gleaming, its success built on the foundation of my unacknowledged contributions. I took a deep breath of the crisp morning air and felt something I hadn't experienced in my father's presence for as long as I could remember. Power. Today was the day everything would change. Not just for me, but for Alexander Denton and the empire he thought he'd built alone. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The empire that, in reality, I had saved and transformed while he dismissed me as a disappointment since birth. The reality check was coming. And it would change everything. The headquarters of Denton Industries rose 42 stories above the financial district, a monument to my father's supposed genius. As I passed through the revolving doors, clutching his laptop in one hand and the USB drive in my pocket, employees nodded respectfully, not because they recognized me as the CEO's son, but because I'd intentionally scheduled my arrival during the morning rush. Anonymity was my ally. I took the executive elevator to the 41st floor, using the key card my father had given me for emergencies only. The corridors were quiet, most executives not due in for another hour. My father prided himself on being first in the building every day, a fact he mentioned at every family gathering, another benchmark of success I could never reach. His corner office door was closed, but unlocked. I entered without knocking, finding him hunched over financial reports, his silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. "Took you long enough?" he said without looking up. "Leave it on the desk." I placed the laptop down and remained, standing, saying nothing. After several seconds of silence, he finally raised his eyes. "Is there something else, Oliver?" "I saw the email," I said quietly. "The one about me. To Lambert." His expression shifted minutely, surprise quickly masked by practice neutrality. "You went through my private correspondence?" "You asked me to set up your email." The draft was open. He leaned back in his leather chair, studying me with clinical detachment. "And now you're what? Hurt? Did you expect me to lie to Lambert about your capabilities?" "I expected basic decency, respect, maybe even support from my father," he sighed, removing his reading glasses. "This is business, Oliver, not a parent-teacher conference. Lambert asked for my professional assessment, and I gave it. You told him I've been a disappointment since birth. Perhaps that was poorly phrased," he conceded, though his tone carried no remorse. "But the substance stands. You've never shown the aptitude for this industry." "That's not a personal failing. We all have different strengths. Yours simply don't align with what Lambert requires." I almost laughed at the practiced diplomacy, the corporate HR speak he'd substituted for genuine fatherly concern. "And what exactly are my strengths, Dad? Have you ever bothered to find out?" "This defensiveness is precisely what I'm talking about," he replied, glancing at his watch. "Look, I have a board meeting in 30 minutes. If you want to continue this conversation, we can schedule time later this week." Schedule time. With my father. To discuss why he's actively sabotaging my career. I shook my head. "No, I don't think we need to schedule anything. I think we should talk about Nathan Reed instead." The name landed like a stone in still water. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, his posture straightening. "What about him?" "You're acquiring his company, Horizon Solutions. That's confidential. Information, Oliver. How did you—" $40 million, I continued. "That's what you're paying for exclusive access to the man who saved your company." My father's expression hardened. "I don't know where you're getting your information, but this conversation is over. Some of us have real work to do." As he reached for his phone, likely to call security, I pulled the USB drive from my pocket and placed it on his desk. "Nathan Reed doesn't exist." He paused, hand hovering over the phone. "What?" "He's a fiction. A pseudonym I created 4 years ago when you laughed me out of this same office for proposing the exact strategies that later saved Denton Industries." Disbelief flashed across his face, followed quickly by dismissive anger. "This is absurd. I've spoken to Reed on video calls. You've spoken to my friend Marcus, an actor who follows my script. The voice you've been hearing in your weekly consultancy calls, voice modulation software, the genius strategies transforming your company? All mine. I tapped the USB drive. It's all here. Every email, every proposal, every implementation report, all the evidence showing that the son you consider a disappointment has been the architect of your company's recent success. My father stared at me, his face unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a sharp, derisive sound that bounced off the floor-to-ceiling windows. This is what I'm talking about, Oliver. These elaborate fantasies, these desperate bids for attention and validation. He shook his head. Reed is a Stanford graduate with 2 decades of industry experience. He has references, credentials, a track record. All fabricated, I replied calmly. Call Stanford right now. Ask about Nathan Reed's doctorate in industrial engineering, class of 2009. They'll have no record because he doesn't exist. My father's certainty wavered visibly. He picked up the USB drive, turning it in his hands as though it might reveal its secrets through touch alone. Why would you do this? Because you never listened to me as your son. Because 4 years ago I came to you with ideas that could save this company, and you dismissed them without even reading past the first page. He inserted the USB drive into his computer, his expression guarded as he began scrolling through the documents. I watched silently as he opened financial reports, implementation timelines, and the original proposal, identical to the one I'd presented to him years ago. Color drained from his face. This doesn't prove anything. You could have obtained these documents through corporate espionage. Check the metadata, Dad. The original files were created on my personal devices. Or don't you know how to do that? I thought you were the technical genius in the family. The barb was childish, but I couldn't resist. He continued scanning files, his disbelief gradually giving way to confusion. The Lambert interview, he said suddenly. That's why you're doing this. To pressure me into supporting your candidacy? This has nothing to do with Lambert, I replied, though it wasn't entirely true. This is about you finally seeing me for who I am, not who you've decided I am. My father leaned back in his chair, studying me with new eyes. Not warmth or pride, but calculation. Always calculation with him. Let's assume for a moment this is true, he began, his voice measured. You've created an elaborate deception, misrepresented yourself to your own family's company, and potentially committed fraud. That hardly demonstrates the judgment and character Lambert, or any reputable firm, would value. I'd anticipated this response, the immediate pivot to offense, reframing my achievement as a moral failing. It was his standard tactic when cornered. Fraud requires intent to deceive for personal gain, I countered. I created Horizon Solutions to provide valuable services that have demonstrably benefited Denton Industries. The company has paid fair, market value for those services and received more than adequate return on investment. Using a false identity, using a pseudonym, I corrected. Many consultants work under business names. And if we're discussing ethics, let's talk about a father who actively undermines his son's career opportunities while pretending to support him. The intercom on his desk buzzed. Mr. Denton, the board members are gathering in the conference room. Without breaking eye contact with me, he pressed the response button. Tell them I'll be delayed. Family emergency. Family emergency. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. My father stood, walking to the window that overlooked the city. For a moment, he was silhouetted against the morning light, his posture rigid with tension. What do you want, Oliver? Recognition. Acknowledgement that I've been the driving force behind Denton Industries' revival. He turned, his expression unreadable. And if I refuse? I hadn't expected such direct resistance to the irrefutable evidence. Even now, confronted with the truth, he was calculating angles, looking for leverage. Then I walk into that board meeting. and tell them that their CEO is about to spend $40 million acquiring a one-person consultancy that consists solely of his own son working from a converted storage space in Brooklyn. I explained that the miraculous turnaround they've attributed to your leadership was actually my work you rejected when I presented it directly. And then I resign as Nathan Reed, effective immediately, leaving you to explain the sudden departure of your miracle worker. My father's eyes narrowed. You'd sabotage your own family's company out of spite? Not spite, truth. There's a difference. He returned to his desk, sinking heavily into his chair. For the first time in my adult life, I saw uncertainty in his posture. The acquisition paperwork is already being processed. Backing out now would create serious questions. Questions you'd have to answer truthfully, I added, or commit securities fraud. We stared at each other across the desk, the weight of decades of misunderstanding and dismissal hanging between us. I waited, expecting more resistance, more manipulation. Instead, his shoulders slumped slightly. Do you have any idea what this would do to my reputation? To the company? I'm not interested in destroying either, I said honestly. I just want what I've earned. And what is that, exactly? The question caught me off guard. What did I want? I'd been so focused on revealing the truth that I hadn't fully considered the aftermath. Recognition, I repeated. Credit for my work. A seat at the table. My father nodded slowly, his mind visibly processing scenarios, calculating outcomes. The board meeting, he said finally. Attend with me. I'll introduce you as the strategic consultant who's been working with us through Horizon Solutions. A first step toward integrating you into the leadership team post-acquisition. I studied him carefully, searching for the trap. And Nathan Reed? We'll need a transition story. Something plausible. Reed accepting a teaching position perhaps, and recommending you as his protege and replacement. He was already crafting the narrative, rewriting reality to preserve his image while accommodating the unavoidable truth. That's not good enough, I said. I don't want to be positioned as Reed's protege. I am Reed. And how exactly do you propose I explain that to the board? That my son created a fake identity to trick his own family's company? I had to admit, he had a point. The full truth would be messy, potentially damaging to the company's stock price and stakeholder confidence. Fine, I conceded. But I want a clear path to legitimate recognition. Director of Strategy position, reporting directly to you. And I want my proposal for international expansion, the one you dismissed last year, implemented immediately. My father raised an eyebrow. You've thought this through. I've had 4 years of being Nathan Reed to consider what Oliver Denton deserves. He checked his watch again. The board is waiting. We can continue this negotiation later. Not a negotiation, I corrected. A recognition of reality. As we walked toward the conference room, my father maintained his usual commanding presence. But I noticed subtle changes, a slight tension in his jaw, a barely perceptible uncertainty in his stride. The unflappable Alexander Denton was rattled. The boardroom fell silent as we entered. 12 faces turned toward us, ranging from curious to concerned at my unexpected presence. Gentlemen, ladies, my father began, his voice betraying none of his inner turmoil. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce my son, Oliver. Some of you may have met him at company functions over the years. Polite, nods around the table. Most had indeed met me, though few had engaged beyond cursory pleasantries. What you may not know, my father continued, is that Oliver has been working closely with Horizon Solutions for the past 4 years, collaborating directly with Nathan Reed on the implementation strategies that have transformed our company, murmurs. A surprise rippled through the room. Thomas Wheatley, the operations director, looked particularly confused. In fact, my father added, with our pending acquisition of Horizon, I've asked Oliver to join Denton Industries in an official capacity, as Director of Strategic Initiatives, reporting directly to me. The announcement hung in the air. I watched the board members' reactions, noting the spectrum from surprise to skepticism to calculation. These were business people first. They would evaluate this development based on its impact on the company's bottom line, not on family dynamics. Cassandra Reeves, the most senior board member, spoke first. While we appreciate family loyalty, Alexander, this is quite sudden. What specific qualifications does Oliver bring to such a senior position? My father turned to me, a silent cue to respond. The moment stretched between us, a test, perhaps, or an opportunity. Over the past 4 years, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. I've designed and implemented the resource allocation system that reduced our production costs by 32%. I developed the predictive market analysis algorithm that positioned us ahead of industry trends. I created the international expansion strategy that doubled our global footprint. I paused, watching comprehension dawn on their faces. Working through Horizon Solutions provided a unique perspective. The freedom to assess Denton Industries objectively, without the constraints of internal politics or preconceptions. Thomas Wheatley leaned forward. You've been working with Reed directly? He's mentioned a protege, but never by name. The prepared fiction was forming before us. I wasn't claiming to be Reed, but his close associate and student. It preserved my father's dignity while acknowledging my contributions, a compromise neither of us had explicitly discussed, but both understood was necessary. Nathan has been a remarkable mentor, I replied, the strange experience of complementing my fictional self almost making me smile. His decision to step back from consulting to pursue academic opportunities created the perfect timing for this transition. The meeting continued, with board members asking increasingly specific questions about my involvement in various initiatives. I answered each with confidence born from intimate knowledge, occasionally deferring to Reed's guidance when strategic. My father watched silently, his expression unreadable to others but translucent to me. I recognized the calculation behind his eyes, the recalibration of decades of assumptions. He wasn't proud, not yet, but he was reassessing, seeing me through new eyes. As the meeting concluded and board members filed out, several stopped to congratulate me on my new position. Thomas Wheatley lingered last. I always sensed something familiar in Reed's approaches, he said thoughtfully. A perspective that aligned remarkably well with Denton principles. Now I understand why. After he left, my father and I remained in the empty boardroom, the weight of the morning's revelations settling between us. You performed well, he said finally, neither praise nor criticism but clinical assessment. I've had practice, I replied, 4 years of being taken seriously. He winced slightly, almost imperceptibly. The Lambert interview, he said. It's in... He checked his watch. 30 minutes. I know. What will you tell them? I considered the question. The interview that had seemed so crucial yesterday now felt strangely diminished. The truth, that I've accepted a position at Denton Industries. My father nodded, processing this information with the same analytical detachment he applied to balance sheets and market projections. For what it's worth, he said, gathering his papers, Lambert would have been lucky to have you. The words weren't an apology or even a direct acknowledgement of his error in judgment. But from Alexander Denton, this modest concession represented a seismic shift. As we walked toward the elevator, an uncomfortable question surfaced in my mind. Would you have sent it, the email to Lambert? He paused before answering, his hand hovering over the elevator button. I believed what I wrote, he said finally, based on what I thought I knew about you. And now? The elevator arrived with a soft chime. We stepped inside, alone with our unresolved history. Now, my father said as the doors closed, I have a lot to reconsider. It wasn't the emotional validation I might have once craved, but it was something more valuable, the beginning of truth between us. As the elevator descended, I realized that the morning's confrontation had changed not just my father's perception of me, but my own understanding of what I truly wanted. Recognition had been only part of it. The deeper need, the one I'd barely acknowledged to myself, was for honesty. To be seen clearly, without the distorting lens of my father's preconceptions or my own defensive reactions. That clarity was finally emerging, unexpected and incomplete, but real. And with it came the unsettling question of what would happen next, not just for my career, but for the complicated, damaged relationship between father and son that had shaped us both. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my new office, on the executive floor of Denton Industries. 48 hours had passed since the confrontation with my father, and the company was still adjusting to the seismic shift in its leadership structure. My sudden elevation had sparked rumors throughout the organization, some speculating about nepotism, others whispering about secret grooming for succession. None had guessed the truth. I stood at the window, observing employees leaving for the day, their figures tiny from this height. My reflection stared back at me. Oliver Denton in a tailored suit, occupying space in the executive wing, a nameplate on my door. All the external markers of success I'd once craved. Yet something felt unfinished. A knock interrupted my thoughts. Eliza Chen, my newly assigned executive assistant, stood in the doorway. "The senior management orientation materials you requested," she said, placing a thick binder on my desk. "And Mr. Denton, your father, asked me to remind you about dinner tonight. 7 o'clock at Aurelia." I thanked her, waiting until she left before opening the binder. Inside were confidential company reports that would have been inaccessible to me before. Executive compensation packages, offshore account details, tax structures, shareholder agreements. The lifeblood of Denton Industries' inner workings. My knee. Phone buzzed with a text from Mira. "Still on for drinks? Need to hear all about the corporate coup." I smiled, typing back, "Rain check? Family dinner tonight." Her response came immediately. "Fascinating development. The prodigal son breaks bread with the tyrant. Take notes for the memoir." Mira's irreverence was exactly what I needed. Since my confrontation with my father, everyone at Denton Industries had treated me with careful deference, a stark contrast to the dismissive attitudes I'd endured for years. The sudden respect felt hollow, unearned by Oliver Denton even if deserved by Nathan Reed. I turned back to the binder, searching for something specific among the corporate documents. My father had agreed to my appointment, acknowledged my contributions, through Horizon Solutions, and even introduced me to the board. But I couldn't shake the suspicion that he was merely playing for time, adapting to changed circumstances while plotting to reassert control. After an hour of methodical reading, I found what I suspected existed, a clause in my employment contract different from standard executive agreements. While most directors had termination protection and clear paths for advancement, mine contained unusual restrictions, including a provision allowing my termination with minimal severance if I engaged in actions detrimental to company reputation or leadership stability. The vague wording gave my father enormous latitude to remove me if I became inconvenient. This wasn't a genuine integration into leadership. It was containment. I closed the binder, unsurprised but disappointed. My father was acknowledging my value only to the extent necessary to protect the company. The fundamental lack of trust, of respect, remained unchanged. The realization crystallized my next steps. If I wanted genuine recognition, not just a temporary accommodation, I needed leverage that couldn't be neutralized with corporate maneuvering, something that would force my father to see me as an equal, not just a useful asset to be managed. I needed to become indispensable. Aurelia Restaurant occupied the top floor of a renovated historical building, offering panoramic views of the city. When I arrived, my father was already seated at his usual table, reviewing documents while nursing a scotch. "Right on time," he noted as I sat down, neither praise nor criticism. "I ordered the '08 Bordeaux. Should be adequately breathed by now." The familiarity of his controlled precision, even in relaxation, everything measured and evaluated, almost made me smile. Almost. "How's the transition proceeding?" he asked after the waiter poured our wine. "Smoothly enough," I replied. Though, some interesting provisions in my employment contract caught my attention. He met my gaze without flinching. "Standard precautionary measures, nothing personal. The ability to terminate me for actions detrimental to leadership stability seems quite personally targeted." My father took a deliberate sip of wine. "Consider our history, Oliver. You created an elaborate deception that could have severely damaged the company. Some guardrails are prudent." "I created solutions that saved the company," I countered. "Solutions you rejected when presented directly, and yet implemented when presented appropriately," he noted. "Perhaps a lesson in effective communication rather than the indictment you perceive." The waiter's return prevented my response. We ordered mechanically, falling into the practiced rhythm of these obligatory dinners, a routine unchanged despite the seismic shifts in our professional relationship. When we were alone again, my father surprised me by changing direction. "The quarterly projections look promising. Your international expansion strategy is outperforming expectations." The acknowledgement, small but unmistakable, caught me off guard. "The Australian market responded particularly well to the adaptive pricing model." He nodded. "Thomas suggested accelerating the Asian rollout based on those results. I'd like your assessment by Monday." "I can have it for you tomorrow," I said, the reflexive overachiever in me responding before I could temper it. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Some things don't change." The comment hung between us, an acknowledgement of patterns established over decades, my constant striving to exceed expectations, his measured withholding of approval. Our entrees arrived, providing a welcome diversion from the uncomfortable recognition. "The board is impressed," he said after several minutes of silence. "Cassandra mentioned your comprehensive understanding of operations." "I've had 4 years of immersion through Horizon," I replied, "though I suspect their approval remains conditional." Naturally, corporate leadership isn't a birthright, regardless of lineage. I studied him across the table. This man who had shaped my identity through his persistent dismissal, who now sat across from me as both father and professional equal. The contradiction seemed to have aged him. New lines marked his face, his shoulders carrying a tension I hadn't noticed before. "What happens to Nathan Reed?" I asked suddenly. "In the official narrative?" My father considered this. "Academic appointment at Stanford. Ongoing advisory role, gradually transitioning responsibilities to you. Clean, credible, minimal disruption." "And the acquisition of Horizon Solutions?" "Proceeds as planned. The structure benefits both parties. Tax advantages for you, continuity for stakeholders." Of course, he had already restructured the situation to maximum advantage. Alexander Denton's adaptation skills were legendary. No setback remained unassimilated into his strategic framework for long. "So I'll receive the $40 million?" I asked, deliberately blunt. He paused, wine glass halfway to his lips. "The terms will be honored, though I'm surprised by your focus on the financial aspect." "Not focused, just confirming. The amount represents the value you placed on Nathan Reed's contributions. Seems relevant to acknowledge it was my work being valued." Something flickered across his expression. Annoyance, perhaps, or reluctant. Respect for the point scored. "The valuation was based on projected future contributions," he said carefully, "which you'll now deliver as Director of Strategic Initiatives. The compensation structures are distinct but equitable." Translation: I wouldn't see most of that money. The acquisition would be restructured to benefit the company, with my compensation channeled through salary and stock options that kept me dependent on continued employment. I'd expected nothing less. The dinner continued with surface-level professional discussion, neither of us acknowledging the deeper currents beneath our careful words. As we finished dessert, my father signed the check without looking at the amount. I have to be at the London office tomorrow. The Gibson merger negotiations need attention. I thought that deal was weeks from finalizing, I said, surprised. Accelerated timeline. Their CEO's health is declining faster than anticipated. They want signatures while he's still capable. I processed this information with growing certainty that it connected to my situation. The Gibson portfolio includes significant Asian manufacturing capacity. Indeed, he confirmed. Their infrastructure will be essential for our expansion. Which is why you need my assessment quickly, I concluded. The merger affects implementation timelines. He nodded, standing to leave. 7 a.m. briefing before my flight, if you can manage it. I'll be there, I assured him, already mentally rearranging my evening to prepare. As we walked out, a realization crystallized. My father needed me right now, needed Nathan Reed's expertise to navigate this accelerated merger while maintaining the Asian expansion. This temporary leverage window was my opportunity to secure something more permanent. The question was how to use it effectively. Back at my apartment, I spread documents across my dining table, half from the company binder, half from my private Horizon Solutions archives. The Gibson merger wasn't just opportunistic timing, it was transformational for Denton Industries' global positioning. But the accelerated timeline created vulnerability. My father was rushing to close before competitors could interfere, before the ailing Gibson CEO deteriorated further, and before market conditions shifted. The aggressive schedule left minimal room for strategic evaluation, precisely the expertise Nathan Reed had provided. I worked through the night, analyzing merger implications, identifying integration challenges, and developing implementation recommendations. By 5 a.m., I had created a comprehensive brief that showcased what my father needed, expertise he couldn't easily replace. But I also developed something else. A parallel analysis, one I didn't intend to share immediately. A contingency plan. That established my independence regardless of how my father responded. At 6:45 a.m., I walked into Denton Industries headquarters, carrying both the requested briefing and my leverage strategy. The building hummed with early morning energy, executives and assistants preparing for the day ahead. Several nodded respectfully as I passed. The new normal that still felt surreal. My father was already in the conference room, reviewing documents with his merger team. He looked up briefly as I entered, acknowledging my presence with a slight nod before returning to his discussion. I took a seat, observing the dynamics around the table. Each executive deferred to my father while jockeying for his attention. A complex dance of ambition and submission I recognized from my own history. When he finally turned to me, his expression was all business. Your assessment? I distributed. The brief I'd prepared, watching as the team began reviewing my analysis. My father scanned it quickly, his eyes narrowing at certain points, nodding at others. I waited, knowing better than to fill the silence with unnecessary elaboration. This integration timeline is aggressive, he noted finally, particularly for the Malaysian facilities. But achievable, I countered. The cultural adaptation framework on page 12 mitigates the primary resistance points. We'd need Thomas's operations team fully engaged from day one. My father studied me with unexpected intensity. You've thought through the human elements more thoroughly than I anticipated. The comment revealed his continued underestimation. Despite everything. Organizational psychology was my minor, I reminded him. People ignore soft factors at their peril during mergers. He turned to the final page, containing my implementation recommendations. These responsibility assignments, you've put yourself in charge of the Asian integration. I'm best qualified, I stated simply. My established relationships with regional partners through Horizon give us advantages no one else can offer. The room fell silent, everyone watching my father for his reaction. Claiming such a crucial role was bold, potentially overreaching in the eyes of executives who had served longer. To their visible surprise, he nodded. Provided the deal closes today, implementation oversight is yours. I expect weekly progress. Reports directly to me. The meeting continued with team members discussing logistics and immediate next steps. I participated as needed, but part of my mind remained focused on the parallel document in my bag, my insurance policy if this apparent victory proved hollow. As the meeting concluded, my father pulled me aside. Walk with me to the elevator. We moved down the hallway, maintaining professional distance despite the personal undercurrents. Your brief was comprehensive, he acknowledged. The board will approve your integration oversight role based on my recommendation. Thank you, I replied, deliberately neutral. He pressed the elevator button, his expression unreadable. This is a significant responsibility, Oliver. Your first visible leadership test. I'm aware. Succeed, and your position becomes considerably more secure. The implied threat in the inverse remained unspoken, but clear. Fail, and justification for removal would be established. As the elevator arrived, I made my decision. Before you leave for London, there's something else you should see. I removed the second document from my bag, handing it to him as he stepped into the elevator. What's this? He asked, glancing at the cover. A parallel implementation strategy I've already discussed with Cassandra Reeves and 2 other board members, I said calmly. A contingency they found quite compelling. His expression hardened. You went behind my back to the board? I explored options, I corrected as the elevator doors began to close. Something Nathan Reed would certainly do. I caught a glimpse of his thunderous expression before the doors sealed completely. My heart pounded as I walked back to my office, knowing I'd just raised the stakes dramatically. The document I'd given him detailed how the Gibson merger could be implemented without Alexander Denton's direct involvement, a contingency plan. Ostensibly developed to ensure continuity if his international travel created bottlenecks, but actually establishing that I could lead independently if necessary. More critically, I had indeed discussed elements of it with Cassandra and 2 other board members, framing it as prudent succession planning while planting seeds that the company's future might be secured through leadership evolution rather than remaining solely dependent on my father. I was no longer merely accepting the role he permitted. I was creating my own path to legitimate authority within Denton Industries. The approach carried enormous risk. My father could react with fury, accelerate plans, to remove me, or worse. But it also established that I wouldn't be managed or marginalized, that Oliver Denton, like Nathan Reed before him, would be recognized for his actual value, not his allocated place in Alexander Denton's hierarchy. My executive assistant appeared in the doorway. Mr. Denton is looking for you. His car to the airport is waiting, but he's in his office. I thanked her, straightening my tie before walking deliberately slowly to my father's office. This confrontation needed to happen on even psychological footing, no rushing to his summons, no defensive posture. When I entered, he stood behind his desk, my document open before him, his expression controlled, but anger evident in his rigid posture. Close the door, he instructed. I complied, remaining standing rather than taking a visitor's chair. What exactly do you think you're doing? He demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. Establishing my value to the company independently of your approval, I replied evenly. Ensuring the board sees viable leadership options. You're deliberately undermining me. I'm protecting myself, I countered. Your contract provisions made your intentions clear. Temporary accommodation until you could safely remove me. I'm simply ensuring that decision would have consequences beyond losing Nathan Reed's expertise. My father's eyes narrowed. You've misunderstood the situation spectacularly. Have I? The termination clause specific to my contract suggests otherwise. He studied me with an intensity I'd rarely experienced, seeming to truly see me for perhaps the first time. The clause was Thomas's idea, he said finally. A safeguard he insisted upon after I proposed your appointment, not my initiative. The revelation caught me off guard. You expect me to believe the operations director dictated terms for a family matter? Family doesn't enter into it, my father replied sharply. This is business. Thomas and the executive team wanted protection against potential nepotism claims if your performance didn't justify your position. I processed this, searching for deception, but finding none in his direct gaze. The board approved your Asian integration oversight unanimously this morning, he continued. Based on your demonstrated expertise, not your last name. And certainly, not because I advocated for you, the implication stunned me. You didn't recommend me. I abstained from the vote, he clarified. To avoid exactly the perception you're reinforcing with these, he gestured at my document, independent initiatives. For the first time since discovering his email to Lambert, I felt uncertainty creep into my righteous anger. If he was telling the truth, if the board had independently validated my value, my parallel strategy wasn't just risky but potentially self-defeating. Your car is waiting, I noted, needing time to recalibrate. He gathered his briefcase, maintaining intense eye contact. This conversation isn't over. When I return from London, we'll address both your performance and your methods. As he moved toward the door, he paused. The Gibson CEO is dying, Oliver. This merger secures thousands of jobs and our company's future. Whatever game you think you're playing, remember that real consequences extend beyond your personal vindication. The words hit their mark, reminding me that Denton Industries wasn't just a battlefield for our damaged relationship. It represented livelihoods, innovations, communities, larger than both of us. After he left, I remained in his office, staring at the empire view his corner windows commanded. The city sprawled below, Denton properties visible throughout the landscape. The physical manifestation of what generations had built, what I had helped strengthen through Nathan Reed's contributions. My phone buzzed with a message from Cassandra Reeves. Impressive analysis in this morning's meeting. The board is confirming your oversight role for Asian integration. Dinner next week to discuss further? I have perspective that might interest you. I stared at the message, understanding its implications. The board chairwoman was establishing direct communication outside my father's mediation, an unprecedented development that suggested my value was being independently assessed at the highest levels. The plan I'd initiated was working, creating space for my contributions to be recognized on their merits. But my father's parting words lingered, raising uncomfortable questions about my methods and motivations. Was I securing legitimate recognition, or merely satisfying wounded pride at the expense of something larger? Was I becoming exactly what I'd resented in my father, someone who prioritized personal victory over collaborative success? As I walked back to my office, employees nodded respectfully, unaware of the internal conflict beneath my composed exterior. Director Oliver Denton, son of the CEO, newly appointed integration leader for the company's biggest international merger. The external validation I'd craved for so long. Yet something remained unresolved, a hollow space where simple pride should have resided. The victory felt incomplete, tainted by tactics that mirrored the very behavior I'd resented in my father. The recognition was real, but the path to achieving it had compromised something essential. At my desk, I opened the folder containing the final Horizon Solutions acquisition papers awaiting my signature. $40 million for a company I'd created to house the brilliance my father had rejected, a valuation that objectively measured my worth. I reached for my pen, then hesitated. The acquisition would permanently separate Oliver Denton from Nathan Reed, the rejected son from the respected strategist. It would resolve the immediate conflict while perpetuating the fundamental dishonesty at its core. The realization crystallized with sudden clarity. Genuine recognition couldn't come from leveraging Nathan Reed's value. It required Oliver Denton to stand on his own merits, visible and accountable. The protection of my alternate identity had served its purpose, but continuing the deception, even in its modified transition form, would prevent the authentic recognition I truly sought. If I wanted my father, and the company, to see me, clearly I needed to step fully into the light without Nathan Reed's shadow offering protection. I sent a message to legal. Hold the Horizon acquisition paperwork. I'll deliver new instructions upon the CEO's return from London. Then I began drafting a memo to the executive team regarding the Asian integration process, signing it clearly and solely as Oliver Denton, with no reference to Nathan Reed's ongoing involvement or guidance. The time for proxies and shields had passed. The real test of my value, and my father's capacity to recognize it, lay ahead. 6 days after my father left for London, Denton Industries buzzed with speculation. The Gibson merger had been announced to thunderous market approval, our stock jumping 15% in a single day. Business channels ran constant commentary on Alexander Denton's strategic masterstroke, with analysts praising the seamless integration plan accompanying the acquisition announcement. What none of them knew was that Alexander Denton hadn't written that integration plan. I had. Even more significant, my father had been unexpectedly detained in London with regulatory complications, leaving me as the public face of the merger's implementation. This morning would be my first solo presentation to the combined executive teams of both companies, 60 senior leaders who would scrutinize my every word, gesture, and decision. I arrived at the Executive Conference Center an hour early, reviewing my presentation while the audiovisual team completed setup. The room gradually filled with Denton executives I knew and Gibson leaders I'd never met, all watching me with varied expressions of curiosity, skepticism, and assessment. Thomas Wheatley approached as I arranged my notes at the podium. "Quite the moment for your solo debut," he observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Your father's absence creates unique challenges." "The plan is solid regardless of who presents it," I replied, maintaining professional composure despite the obvious test in his comment. "Indeed. Though many here expected Alexander himself for something this significant." I met his gaze directly. "They'll have to settle for the person who actually designed the integration strategy." Thomas raised an eyebrow, surprised by my directness. Before he could respond, Cassandra Reeves joined us, elegant in a precisely tailored suit that commanded attention despite her diminutive stature. "Oliver," she greeted me warmly. "I've just been speaking with Gibson's board chair. They're particularly impressed with the cultural sensitivity in the Malaysian facility transition plan." Thomas nodded reluctantly. "Remarkably thorough work for someone so new to our executive team." Cassandra's smile held knowing amusement. "Perhaps not as new as his title suggests." She turned to me. "We're ready when you are, Director Denton." I took my position at the podium, I surveyed the room, familiar faces from Denton, unknown executives from Gibson, and at the very back, entering quietly through a side door, my father. My pulse quickened. He wasn't supposed to return until tomorrow. Our unfinished confrontation hung between us across the crowded room, his expression unreadable as he took a seat without announcement or acknowledgement. I didn't alter my presentation to accommodate his unexpected presence. Instead, I proceeded exactly as planned, walking both companies' leadership through the integration strategy with calm authority. I addressed potential friction points directly, acknowledged cultural challenges honestly, and presented implementation timelines with confident precision. Throughout, I noticed my father watching intently, his focus unwavering, not evaluating or judging as he typically would, but observing with unusual attention, as though seeing something new. During the Q&A session, Gibson's operations chief raised concerns about their Malaysian facility's unique management structure. Before I could respond, Thomas interjected, "Perhaps we should defer this question to CEO Denton, now that he's joined us." All eyes turned to my father at the back of the room. A perfect opportunity for him to reassert control, to remind everyone of the hierarchy. I braced myself for the subtle undermining that had characterized our relationship for decades. Instead, my father stood and said simply, "The question was directed to Director Denton, who developed the Malaysian transition strategy. I'm here, merely as an observer today." The room rippled with surprise, none greater than my own. My father, who controlled every conversation, who never relinquished authority, had publicly deferred to me on a critical strategic matter. I recovered quickly, addressing the question comprehensively while processing this unprecedented development. The meeting continued for another hour, with executives from both companies engaging deeply with the integration plan. Throughout, my father remained silent, observing from the back as I fielded inquiries on everything from supply chain optimization to talent retention strategies. When we finally concluded, executives gathered in small groups, discussion buzzing throughout the room. I packed my materials methodically, aware of my father approaching the podium. "Walk with me," he said quietly. Neither request nor command, but something in between. We moved through the building silently, attracting curious glances from employees, unaccustomed to seeing us together outside formal settings. He led me to a small conference room I'd never entered, a space without windows or distractions, used for the most sensitive negotiations. "Your presentation was excellent," he said, once the door closed behind us. "Comprehensive, authoritative, persuasive." I nodded, accepting the assessment without reacting to its unprecedented nature. "Thank you." The board is impressed. Gibson's leadership is reassured. He paused, studying me with that same unusual intensity I'd noticed in the meeting. "You've established yourself quite effectively in my absence." "That was the intention," I acknowledged, maintaining direct eye contact. "Yes, I expect it was." My father moved to the small conference table, taking a seat and gesturing for me to join him. "We have several matters to discuss, not least the Horizon acquisition you've mysteriously suspended." I sat across from him, the polished table between us like a demilitarized zone. "Not suspended, reconsidered." "Explain." "I'm dissolving Horizon Solutions entirely," I said, "effective immediately." This caught him off guard, a rare occurrence I might have savored under different circumstances. "That's $40 million you're walking away from." Money was never the objective. Then what was? The directness of his question created an opening for honesty I hadn't anticipated. Recognition, respect, acknowledgement of my capabilities. My father leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "And you believe you've secured those without the acquisition?" "I'm establishing them directly, as Oliver Denton, not through Nathan Reed's reputation or Horizon's valuation." He considered this, his fingers drumming once on the table, a subtle tell of genuine contemplation I recognized from board meetings. "An interesting calculation. Less financially advantageous, but potentially more sustainable professionally." The clinical assessment was so characteristic that I almost smiled. Even in this moment of reckoning, Alexander Denton evaluated personal dynamics as business strategy. "I've had legal prepare termination documents for Horizon," I continued. "All intellectual property transfers directly to Denton Industries at no cost. All outstanding contracts will be fulfilled under the Denton banner by my department. Clean. Efficient. He nodded with reluctant approval. Though it leaves the question of how we explain Nathan Reed's abrupt disappearance to clients and partners who valued his involvement specifically, we don't, I stated firmly. Nathan Reed becomes a historical footnote, a consultant whose contributions are now integrated into Denton's institutional knowledge. His continued existence only perpetuates a fiction that undermines my actual position. My father studied me with renewed intensity. You're eliminating your safety net. I'm eliminating an illusion. Nathan Reed was necessary when you refused to recognize Oliver Denton's value. That's no longer the situation. Isn't it? The question hung between us, heavy with implication. I met his gaze directly. You tell me. For several seconds, silence filled the room as decades of miscommunication, dismissal, and wounded pride crystallized into this single moment of potential honesty between us. I read the email to Lambert, I said finally, refusing to let the silence dilute the core issue. You called me a disappointment since birth, someone who would never amount to anything significant. Those weren't observations about my professional capabilities. They were judgments about my fundamental worth. My father didn't flinch from the direct confrontation. They were assessments based on the person I believed you to be. A person you never bothered to actually know, I countered. You decided who I was before giving me any chance to demonstrate otherwise. And you proved me wrong, he acknowledged, the admission so unexpected it momentarily disrupted my prepared arguments. Not just with Nathan Reed's contributions, but with how you've handled this entire situation, strategically, methodically, effectively. The acknowledgement should have felt vindicating. Instead, it highlighted how rare such recognition had been. Throughout my life, how exceptional it was to hear Alexander Denton admit an error in judgment, particularly regarding me. The board meeting this morning wasn't coincidental, he continued. I wanted to observe you without interference or preparation, to see you as others see you, not filtered through our history. And your conclusion? That I've been operating with outdated data, he said, the technical phrasing so characteristic it almost made me smile. Your capabilities exceed my historical assessment. Coming from anyone else, this would have been laughably inadequate, a clinical acknowledgement where personal regret was warranted. But from my father, it represented unprecedented concession. That's it? I pressed, unwilling to accept such measured admission. You've systematically undermined and dismissed me for decades, and your response is essentially, my data was outdated. His expression tightened. What would you prefer, Oliver? Emotional self-flagellation? Public apology? Neither would be genuine from me, and you know it. The honesty in his response was oddly refreshing. Alexander Denton acknowledging his emotional limitations rather than disguising them behind corporate phrasing. I want acknowledgement of the damage done, I said finally. Not just recognition of my capabilities now, but admission that your dismissal shaped my entire life, forced me to create an alternate identity just to be heard. My father fell silent, his gaze drifting to the wall behind me. For a moment, I glimpsed something I'd rarely seen in his expression. Not calculation or assessment, but genuine reflection. When you were born, he began unexpectedly, I held you and felt terror. Not joy, not pride, visceral fear. Fear that I would fail you, damage you, prove inadequate to the responsibility. The personal revelation was so uncharacteristic that I remained silent, afraid any response might halt this unprecedented glimpse into his inner world. My own father measured worth through achievement alone, he continued. Anything less than excellence was weakness. I internalized that measurement system so completely that when I looked at you, this tiny, vulnerable being depending on me, I could only see the standards you would inevitably face, the judgments awaiting you. He met my gaze directly. I didn't dismiss you, Oliver. I was preparing you for a world that would show no mercy for inadequacy. By ensuring I never felt adequate, I concluded bitterly. By pushing you to exceed what you believed possible, he countered. A flawed approach, clearly. The results speak for themselves. The clinical detachment returned to his tone, his emotional disclosure reaching its limit. Yet something had shifted in the atmosphere between us, some hardened barrier beginning to fracture. Where does this leave us? I asked finally. Professionally, and otherwise. My father straightened in his chair, returning to more comfortable territory. Professionally, your position is secure. The board has independently validated your value to Denton Industries. The Malaysian integration oversight remains yours, with expanded authority given your performance thus far. He paused, venturing back toward the personal with visible discomfort. As for otherwise, that requires further consideration from both of us. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't the emotional validation I might have once craved. But it was acknowledgement of a relationship that extended beyond corporate hierarchy, a relationship worthy of consideration rather than default patterns. I'm dissolving Nathan Reed completely, I reiterated. If my position depends on maintaining that fiction, it doesn't, my father interrupted firmly. Oliver Denton's contributions stand on their own merit now. The phrase struck me with unexpected force. The simple acknowledgement I'd sought for so long, delivered without qualification or diminishment. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it with characteristic impatience, then stood. Gibson's regulatory team needs immediate consultation. We'll continue this discussion later. Just like that, the moment of potential reconciliation yielded to business demands, exactly as it had throughout my childhood. Some patterns weren't so easily broken. As he reached the door, however, he turned back. Oliver, one thing is unambiguously clear. I significantly underestimated you. That won't happen again. After he left, I remained in the conference room, processing the conversation's implications. My father hadn't apologized. I hadn't expected him to. Alexander Denton didn't apologize. He adjusted strategies based on updated information. But he had acknowledged my value in terms he understood: professional respect, position security, expanded authority. For the pragmatic, emotionally constrained man my father was, this represented significant evolution. Whether it constituted adequate recognition for decades of dismissal remained uncertain. My phone buzzed with a message from Eliza. Urgent call from Cassandra Reeves. Says it's regarding board deliberations this morning. I called her immediately, curious about what had transpired after I'd left. Oliver, she greeted me, her tone warmly professional. I thought you should know that the board unanimously approved your permanent appointment as Executive Vice President of Strategic Development, effective immediately. The news stunned me. That position doesn't exist in our current structure. It does now? She replied with satisfaction. Created specifically to recognize your unique contributions and secure your place in the company's leadership succession. The implications were enormous. A vice presidency created for me, approved unanimously by a board known for conservative governance decisions. My father couldn't have proposed this, I said, knowing such a move would require preparation and advocacy he couldn't have orchestrated during his London trip. He didn't, Cassandra confirmed. I did, with Thomas's support, interestingly enough. Alexander abstained from the vote but made no objection. This revelation shifted my understanding significantly. My father hadn't orchestrated recognition. The board had independently assessed my value and moved to secure it, with his tacit acceptance rather than his advocacy. There's more, Cassandra continued. The board also voted to establish a formal succession planning committee, with you specifically identified as a potential future chief executive. Alexander supported this motion actively. My father, who had clung to absolute control throughout his career, had endorsed formal succession planning that included me as a candidate. Not orchestrated it, not controlled it, but supported a process that acknowledged my potential to eventually replace him. "I thought you should hear this directly," Cassandra concluded, "particularly given the complex dynamics at play. Your contributions have been recognized on their merits, Oliver. Whatever path brought you here, your position now stands independent of both Nathan Reed's reputation and your father's influence." After we disconnected, I sat alone in the conference room, processing these developments. The recognition I'd sought had arrived, not through confrontation or leverage, but through demonstrated capability and independent assessment by those with the authority to secure my position. Yet something remained unresolved. The professional acknowledgement felt hollow without personal reconciliation. My father had admitted underestimating me but hadn't addressed the deeper wounds his dismissal had created. The decades of feeling inadequate, invisible, unworthy of attention except when serving his interests, these personal injuries remained unacknowledged. My phone buzzed again, a meeting request from my father for 7 p.m. at his penthouse. The subject, line read simply, "Continuing our discussion, dinner provided." I accepted without comment, uncertain what this unprecedented invitation signified. In all my adult life, I'd never been invited to my father's home for a one-on-one dinner. Our interactions occurred in restaurants, offices, or larger family gatherings where personal conversation could be avoided. As the day progressed, I focused on implementation tasks for the Gibson merger, my mind occasionally drifting to the evening's uncertain prospect. By 6:30, I had completed my immediate responsibilities and was preparing to leave when Thomas Wheatley appeared in my doorway. "Congratulations on the promotion," he said, his expression revealing genuine respect I'd never seen directed toward me before. "Well deserved." "Thank you," I replied, surprised by his unexpected acknowledgement. He hesitated, then entered my office fully, closing the door behind him. "There's something you should know before your meeting with Alexander. Tonight." My attention sharpened. "What's that?" "4 years ago, when you first approached him with those initial strategies as Oliver Denton, he didn't dismiss them as readily as you believe." This unexpected claim caught me off guard. He laughed me out of his office without reading past. "The first page." Thomas shook his head slightly. "He had me review your entire proposal afterward. We implemented several elements quietly, without attribution." The revelation landed like a physical blow. "What?" "Alexander has always had difficulty acknowledging contributions from family members, a blind spot from his own upbringing." Thomas's discomfort with this personal disclosure was evident. "But he recognized the value in your work even then." "Why are you telling me this now?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Because despite our professional differences, I respect what you've accomplished. And because sustainable succession requires truth, however uncomfortable." With that cryptic observation, he wished me good evening and departed, leaving me with yet another piece of the complex puzzle that was Alexander Denton and our damaged relationship. At precisely 7 o'clock, I arrived at my father's penthouse, the doorman greeting me by name and directing me to the private elevator. As I ascended to the top floor, I considered Thomas's revelation and its implications. Had my father actually recognized my value years earlier, but been unable to acknowledge it directly? Had I constructed an elaborate deception to prove something he already knew but couldn't express? The elevator opened directly into the penthouse foyer. My father stood waiting, dressed not in his usual business attire, but casual clothes I rarely saw him wear. A simple button-down shirt, no tie, sleeves rolled to expose forearms marked with the faint scars of his early years working in the original Denton factory. "Right on time," he noted, echoing his comment from our recent dinner, but without the evaluative undertone. He led me not to the formal dining room but to the kitchen, where a casual meal was arranged on the central island. Nothing elaborate, Or impressive, just simple food prepared without pretension. I thought we might speak more comfortably here, he explained, gesturing toward a stool. Without the theater of restaurants or conference rooms. As we settled into this unexpectedly informal setting, I realized Alexander Denton was attempting something profoundly difficult for him. Genuine personal connection without the protective barriers of professional context or public performance. The conversation that followed would determine whether Nathan Reed's final legacy would be reconciliation or merely recognition. Whether the genius my father had forgotten could finally be seen not just for his value to Denton Industries, but for his worth as a son. 18 months after that pivotal dinner in my father's kitchen, I stood on the balcony of Denton Industries' Hong Kong office, watching the harbor lights shimmer against the night sky. The Asian Division headquarters, my headquarters, represented everything that had changed since my confrontation with Alexander Denton. My assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your father's video call is ready, sir." I smiled at the formality she maintained even when we were alone in the office. Old habits from the Denton corporate culture died hard, despite my efforts to create a more collaborative environment. In my private office, I activated the secure connection. My father's face appeared on screen, the Singapore skyline visible through the window behind him. "Oliver," he greeted me, his tone businesslike but lacking the dismissive edge that had once characterized our interactions. "The quarterly results are impressive, particularly the Malaysian expansion. We exceeded projections by 17%, I confirmed. The cultural integration framework is paying dividends." He nodded, making notes on a tablet out of view. "The board is pleased. Cassandra specifically mentioned your leadership in developing regional talent." This simple acknowledgement, delivered without qualification or diminishment, still carried weight, though the desperate need for his approval had faded considerably over the past year and a half. Our conversation continued professionally for several minutes, addressing strategic matters with the efficient rapport we'd developed as business partners. The wounds hadn't healed completely, perhaps they never would, but we'd established something neither of us had anticipated that night in his kitchen: a functioning relationship built on mutual respect. As our agenda concluded, my father's expression shifted subtly. "Your mother mentioned you might return for Thanksgiving." This venture into personal territory remained awkward for him, his discomfort visible despite the thousands of miles between us. "If the Jakarta negotiations conclude on schedule," I confirmed. He nodded, hesitating before adding, "She'd appreciate that." "We both would." The simple statement represented significant evolution for Alexander Denton, who had never previously expressed personal desire for my company outside professional contexts. After we disconnected, I turned to the framed document, hanging on my office wall, the only personal item in the otherwise minimalist space. It wasn't my executive appointment or any professional accolade, but a handwritten note my father had given me the night of our kitchen conversation. "Oliver, your path proved wiser than mine. That merits acknowledgement." A.D. Those 12 words, delivered without witnesses, fanfare, or expectation of response, had meant more than the executive vice presidency, more than the board's unanimous recognition, more than the $40 million I'd declined for Horizon Solutions. The note confirmed what our conversation that night had revealed. Alexander Denton was incapable of conventional emotional reconciliation. He couldn't articulate regret for decades of dismissal or acknowledge the personal damage his blindness had caused. But in his own limited way, he had recognized not just my professional value, but the wisdom of my approach. A concession that represented extraordinary personal growth for a man so rigidly certain of his own correctness. My phone buzzed with a message from Mira. Conference keynote posted online. "You're officially a corporate inspiration story. Nauseating but impressive." I smiled, clicking the link she'd attached. My recent address at the Global Business Forum had garnered unexpected attention. not for the content on international expansion, strategies, but for the brief personal anecdote I'd shared about creating Nathan Reed out of necessity. The story had resonated powerfully in business circles, sparking conversations about recognizing talent regardless of source, about leadership, blindness, about the innovative potential stifled by rigid hierarchies. Several major publications had reached out for interviews, and a prominent business school had asked me to lead a case study discussion on organizational psychology and talent recognition. What none of them knew, what only my father and I fully understood, was that the story wasn't primarily about business innovation or corporate strategy. It was about a son desperate to be seen by his father, and a father incapable of seeing beyond his own limited perspective until forced to confront irrefutable evidence. The aftermath of our confrontation had unfolded in ways neither of us could have predicted. My appointment as executive vice president had been followed 6 months later by operational responsibility for the entire Asian division, a role I'd earned through demonstrated results rather than leveraged negotiation. My father had gradually ceded control over various aspects of the business, not as capitulation, but as strategic delegation to demonstrated capability. The succession planning committee continued its work, with increasing transparency about potential leadership transitions. More surprising was the shift in our personal dynamic. We would never have the easy, affectionate relationship other fathers and sons enjoyed. Alexander Denton remained emotionally constrained, analytically focused, and fundamentally shaped by his own harsh upbringing. But he had developed something previously unimaginable: respect for my judgment, independent of its alignment with his own. This respect manifested in small ways that carried significant meaning. Soliciting my input on matters outside my direct responsibility. Acknowledging when my approach proved more effective than his recommendations. Most telling, introducing me to business associates not as my son Oliver, but as Oliver Denton, our EVP of Strategic Development, allowing my professional identity to stand independently. For my part, I had released the desperate need for validation that had driven me to create Nathan Reed. The elaborate deception had served its purpose, forcing recognition that could not have been achieved through conventional means, but maintaining it would have perpetuated the fundamental dishonesty at its core. In dissolving Horizon Solutions and fully integrating my contributions under my own name, I had taken the risk of standing exposed without Nathan Reed's protective shield. The risk had yielded greater rewards than I'd anticipated, both professionally and personally. Perhaps most significant was the gradual untangling of my self-worth from my father's assessment. Alexander Denton's opinion still mattered. He remained a brilliant strategist whose insights I valued, but it no longer defined my fundamental identity or determined my path. My assistant appeared at the door. "The Jakarta team is assembled in Conference Room A, sir." I gathered my materials, glancing once more at the framed note on my wall. The journey from rejected son to recognized leader had been neither clean nor complete. The wounds of decades couldn't be healed through a single confrontation or even 18 months of improved relations. Yet something fundamental had shifted. My father had been forced to see me clearly, to recognize not just my professional contributions, but the determination, creativity, and strategic thinking that had made Nathan Reed necessary in the first place. As I walked toward the conference room, I passed a wall of portraits, the leadership team I'd assembled for the Asian division. Diverse faces representing 6 countries, multiple educational backgrounds, varied career paths. Among them, several individuals who had been overlooked or underestimated in their previous roles, whose talents I had specifically identified and elevated. This, perhaps, was Nathan Reed's most meaningful legacy. Not the strategic innovations that had transformed Denton Industries, not the personal vindication of finally being recognized by my father, but the perspective shaped by years of being dismissed and undervalued. That experience had created in me a heightened awareness of overlooked potential, a commitment to recognizing talent regardless of its packaging. My father had called me a failure who would never amount to anything. That judgment, painful as it had been, had ultimately shaped me into a leader determined never to make the same mistake with others. In the conference room, I took my place at the head of the table, studying the faces turned expectantly toward me. Not one of them knew the full story of how I'd arrived at this position, the desperate creation of Nathan Reed, the years of hidden contributions, the confrontation that had finally forced recognition of my value. They knew only Oliver Denton, Executive Vice President, the leader who listened to their ideas with genuine interest and judged their contributions on merit rather than hierarchical position. As I began the meeting, I realized this was the ultimate reality check I had delivered to my father. Not just proving my individual worth, but demonstrating a leadership approach fundamentally different from his, one that actively sought and recognized potential he would have overlooked. Alexander Denton had built an empire through force of will and singular vision. I was transforming it through collaborative innovation and talent recognition. Both approaches created value, but the latter built a legacy that could outlast any individual. That was the true measure of having amounted to something. Not just proving my father wrong, but creating something meaningful from the very experience of being underestimated. The failure who would never amount to anything had become someone who helped others overcome the same judgment and built a stronger company in the process. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.